A Turkish admiral once drew Antarctica without its ice. This is not a fantasy, but a historical artifact, one of 30 ancient maps that depict lands long before their official discovery. By the end of this journey, you will see human history not as a straight line, but as a web of forgotten voyages and astonishing knowledge. How could a 16th century chart show the coast of a continent not found for 300 more years? What do these parchments reveal about civilizations that left no other trace? We are about to examine maps that challenge everything we think we know about exploration, from a Norse sketch of America to a Korean chart of medieval Europe. Each one is a piece of a much larger and far stranger puzzle. What does it mean when the past seems to know more than the present? The year is 1513. In a quiet room overlooking the Bosphorus, a Turkish admiral named Piri Reis is not dreaming of the future, but carefully assembling pieces of the past. His work surface is a sheet of gazelle skin, and his sources are a cartographer's treasure trove, a collection of about 20 older charts. Some were captured from Portuguese sailors, others were taken from Spanish navigators, and a few, he notes in his own writings, dated back to the time of Alexander the Great. From this mosaic of information, he compiles a world map of breathtaking scope. It shows the coast of Brazil with a precision that startles modern historians, and it hints at lands far to the south that should not have been known to exist. But the most controversial feature lies at the very bottom edge of the parchment. There, a rough, unmistakable landmass is depicted, connected to South America by a curious, thin stretch of land. For many researchers, this can only be one thing: the northern coastline of Antarctica. And according to the admiral's own notes, this section was drawn from even older source maps, charts that showed these southern regions not buried under miles of glacial ice, but as a green and temperate shore. The implications are profound. Modern science tells us the last time Antarctica could have been ice-free was millions of years ago, long before any recorded human civilization. So what was Piri Reis looking at? Could his sources have preserved a memory of the continent from a radically different climatic epoch, a memory passed down through a chain of lost libraries and seafaring cultures that ultimately ended up in his hands? Or does the map represent something else entirely, a misunderstood fragment of Patagonia or a speculative cartographer's guess? The debate is fierce, but the map itself is silent, offering only its impossible coastline as a challenge. This single artifact, drawn just 2 decades after Columbus first reached the Americas, suggests that the world's edges were not blank spaces waiting to be filled, but were perhaps already known, their outlines carefully preserved on parchment that time has since erased. The Piri Reis map does not give us answers, it presents us with a doorway, and stepping through it, we begin to see that this admiral's chart is not an isolated anomaly, but the first thread in a much larger tapestry of forgotten knowledge. Decades after the Piri Reis map was found, another document emerged that sent shockwaves through the academic world. It was called the Vinland Map. This simple parchment, which appeared in the 1960s, was said to be a copy from the 1440s. Its drawing of the world is typical for a medieval European chart, with one extraordinary addition. West of Greenland, it shows a large, rugged island, labeled clearly in Latin, Vinland. This name is not a modern invention. It comes directly from the Norse sagas, the epic stories that tell of Leif Eriksson's voyage to a land of wild grapes around the year 1000. If this map was genuine, it would be the earliest known drawing to place North America on a European map, predating Columbus by over half a century. The discovery seemed to be a stunning physical confirmation of the Viking sagas, a piece of parchment that could rewrite the story of who discovered the Americas. But from the moment it surfaced, the map was wrapped in doubt. The controversy did not center on what it showed, but on what it was made of. Advanced analysis focused on the ink. Some tests suggested the black lines contained a modern chemical compound, anatase, a form of titanium dioxide not commonly used in ink until the 20th century. This finding pointed strongly to a clever forgery, yet other studies argued the compound could have formed naturally over centuries or been a contaminant. The debate over the parchment's age, the script style, and the map's provenance became a battleground for historians and scientists alike. This intense scrutiny teaches us a profound lesson about historical discovery. The excitement of finding a document that fits a perfect narrative is often met with the rigorous, sometimes frustrating, process of verification. The Vinland Map, whether a medieval treasure or an elaborate fake, forces us to ask difficult questions. How do we prove the past? What happens when a single artifact threatens to overturn a long-held story? The saga of this map is a mystery in itself, a reminder that sometimes the history of history is just as compelling as the events it tries to record. And while scholars continue to analyze its lines, the map's very existence points our gaze back to the North Atlantic, to the daring voyages of the Norse, and to other medieval charts that began to hint at a world far larger than Europe ever imagined. Sometimes a map is not a guide, but a ghost story written in coastline and compass rose. In 1558, a Venetian nobleman named Niccolo Zeno published a curious document. A map and narrative he claimed were based on the lost letters and charts of his ancestors, two brothers named Niccolo and Antonio Zeno. According to the tale, these brothers had sailed into the North Atlantic in the late 1300s, decades before Columbus, reaching strange and wondrous lands. The Zeno map that resulted is a cartographic chimera. It shows a familiar Greenland, but to its south sits a large, detailed island labeled Friesland, a place that does not exist. Further west, beyond even mythical islands like Icaria, lies a vast coastline named Estatiland, described as a rich land where the people had libraries and brewed beer. For over 2 centuries, this map was taken seriously. Great explorers like Martin Frobisher used it, searching in vain for the prosperous Friesland. Cartographers faithfully copied its phantom islands onto their own charts, giving fictional places a very real presence in the European imagination. So what are we to make of it? Most historians now see the Zeno map as a fascinating palimpsest, a layer cake of different kinds of knowledge. At its base, there likely are fragments of genuine Norse sailing lore, stories of Helluland, Markland, and Vinland that had filtered down through the centuries, perhaps via fishermen or traders. These real reports then became entangled with medieval legends of Atlantic islands like St. Brendan's Isle, and were likely embellished by a descendant eager to burnish his family's legacy. The result is a map that is neither wholly truth nor pure fiction, but a testament to how all early maps were created, a blend of hard-won observation, second-hand report, and the irresistible human urge to fill empty spaces with possibility. The persistence of Friesland on maps for hundreds of years answers a deeper question about these ancient charts. They were not just records, they were catalysts. A single line on a piece of parchment could launch a fleet, drain a king's treasury, and send men searching for a shore that was only ever ink and speculation. The Zeno map shows us that the power of a map lies not always in its accuracy, but in its inspiration. It prepared the minds of explorers for a world that was strange and full of potential wonders, a psychological priming that was necessary before the physical world could ever be fully revealed. And this blending of the seen and the unseen, the documented and the dreamed, points us toward an even older tradition of mapmaking, one that sought to chart not just lands but the cosmos itself. The phantom islands of the Zeno map reveal a world shaped by story as much as by sail, but another chart from the same era presents a different kind of puzzle, one built not on legend but on startling, specific geometry. In 1559, just 1 year after the Zeno narrative was published, an Ottoman cartographer named Hadji Ahmed produced a world map of a completely different character. Its depiction of the world is framed within an intricate, interlocking pattern of circles and curves, a masterpiece of design, but it is the left side of the parchment that demands a second look. There, drawn with a crisp, confident line, is the western coastline of the Americas, from the sweeping arc of Alaska down to the tapered land of Central America. The shape is not a rough sketch, it is eerily recognizable. For context, at this moment in history, European maps of this region were still a mess of confusion. California was often shown as a giant island, the Pacific Northwest was a complete blank, and the true contours of the continent were still being pieced together from sporadic and often secretive voyages. Yet here was an Ottoman scholar working from Istanbul presenting a coastline of geometric clarity. This precision is the core of the mystery. Hadji Ahmed did not claim to have sailed these waters himself. Like Piri Reis before him, he was a compiler working from source materials. But what sources could possibly have contained such accurate information about a hemisphere that was, officially, still being explored? The map itself offers no answer, only the evidence of its own lines. Some researchers looking at its mathematical style and the flow of its data have proposed a radical idea. Could this knowledge have come from the East, not the West? There were vast, sophisticated networks of trade and scholarship that connected the Islamic world with Asia. Chinese treasure fleets under Admiral Zheng he had, decades earlier, undertaken voyages of staggering scale, reaching the coast of Africa and possibly beyond. While no surviving Chinese map shows the Americas, the idea that geographic knowledge from such voyages could have filtered westward along the Silk Road is not impossible. Alternatively, could Arab or Persian merchants, navigating by the stars across the Indian Ocean, have encountered Pacific currents or stories that found their way into a cartographer's workshop? The Hadji Ahmed map does more than just show a coastline. It silently testifies to a forgotten pipeline of information. It forces us to widen our lens and reconsider the 16th century, not as the age of European discovery alone, but as a moment when multiple streams of geographic knowledge from multiple ancient and medieval cultures were finally converging on the page. The map asks us a quiet, profound question. How much of what we call discovery was actually rediscovery? The final reassembly of a global puzzle whose pieces had been scattered across different civilizations for centuries. This notion of a connected pre-Columbian world is not just speculation. It finds a startling echo in a place no one would expect, in the court of a Chinese emperor, on a map carved in stone. The Hadji Ahmed map hints at knowledge flowing from east to west. But what about a map that seems to predict the future shape of a continent still buried in ice? In 1737, the French geographer Philippe Buache presented a map that was, by his own admission, a work of theory. He was not claiming to have seen the southern continent, but rather to have deduced its existence and even its structure from the patterns of ocean currents and the reported sightings of icebergs by earlier explorers. His map shows a speculative Antarctica, but it is a very specific speculation. He depicted it not as a single mass, but as two large landmasses separated by a wide channel of sea. For over a century, this was seen as an interesting but incorrect hypothesis, the guesswork of a brilliant academic mind. Then, in the 1950s and 60s, modern science began to peel back the ice with seismic and radar surveys. What they found beneath the colossal glacial sheet was startling. The continent of Antarctica is, in fact, comprised of two major landmasses. There is East Antarctica, a large continental shield, and West Antarctica, a smaller archipelago of islands, and they are indeed separated by a vast, deep trench, the transantarctic mountain range acting as a divider. Buache's theoretical channel aligned almost perfectly with the subglacial geography that technology would not confirm for another 200 years. So how did he get it so right? The most compelling explanation lies not in psychic vision but in lost sources. Buache was a meticulous scholar who had access to old maritime archives. He references earlier maps and explorers' logs that are now lost to us. It is entirely possible that within those documents were fragments of much older knowledge, perhaps from the same mysterious tradition that informed the Piri Reis map, descriptions or crude sketches of a southern land that had been passed down through generations of cartographers and sailors. Buache, applying the rational scientific principles of his age, took these fragments and wove them into a coherent, theoretical whole. His map represents a fascinating moment of intersection, where scholarly deduction met the faint, lingering echo of ancient data. It forces us to ask what else might have been preserved in those forgotten archives. What other truths about our world were once known, then dismissed as legend, only to be rediscovered millennia later by machines probing beneath the ice? This idea that artistic and theoretical maps can contain profound hidden truths leads us to a chart that is undeniably a masterpiece of art, but may also be a startlingly accurate portrait of a lost world. While Buache's map was a theory of ice, another chart from 2 centuries earlier was a work of art and philosophy. In 1531, the French mathematician Oronce Finé presented the world in the shape of a heart. This elegant, symbolic projection was more than a romantic gesture. It was a complete vision of the planet, one that filled the vast southern oceans with a sprawling continent labeled Terra Australis. This was not a new idea. The ancient Greeks had proposed a great southern land to balance the northern continents, believing the world must be symmetrical to be stable. Finé, a man of the Renaissance, did something remarkable. He fused this classical philosophy with the very latest empirical data. He carefully incorporated the narrow, newly discovered strait navigated by Magellan's expedition, the first proof that one could sail around the world. Yet on his map, that strait did not open into an endless Pacific. It carved between the southern tip of South America and the northern coast of his imagined supercontinent. Here we see the cartographic mind in a moment of profound transition, one foot in the library of ancient thought and the other on the deck of a modern exploration ship. The mythical Terra Australis was not just a pretty idea, it became a cartographic fact for generations, driving expeditions and shaping geopolitics. Explorers like Quiros and Tasman sailed with Finé's heart-shaped world in mind, searching for the riches of this theoretical land. They did not find a single massive continent, of course, but in their searches they found something real: the islands of the South Pacific and the actual coasts of Australia and New Zealand. The myth created the motivation that led to genuine discovery. This pattern forces us to reconsider the very nature of error on an ancient map. A phantom coastline is not always a mistake. Sometimes it is a question, an argument, or a hypothesis drawn in ink. It is a placeholder for the unknown, shaped by the best logic of its time. The enduring power of Terra Australis reveals a fundamental truth about our relationship with the world. We are often guided to real destinations by maps that are, in crucial ways, wrong. We fill the blanks not with randomness but with stories, and then we sail out to see if the stories are true. This European tradition of blending data and dogma, however, was not the only way to see the world. To find maps that operated on a completely different set of rules, we must journey far from the heart-shaped projections of Paris to a royal library in Korea, where a different globe was being drawn. In the royal courts of Seoul in 1402, a world was being drawn from a viewpoint no European could have imagined. The Kangnido Map, a magnificent silk scroll over 5 feet long, presents the Earth not with Europe at its center, but with China, the Middle Kingdom, as its heart. This was not an act of ignorance but of profound and interconnected knowledge. The map synthesizes three great streams of learning: Chinese administrative records, Korean maritime charts, and crucially, Islamic geographic science that had traveled east along the Silk Road. The result is a staggering vision of the world from an East Asian perspective, one that shows Africa with a shape that is instantly recognizable, a triangular peninsula pointing south, and Europe rendered as a cluster of peninsulas and islands at the far western edge. The Mediterranean Sea is clearly defined, and the Arabian Peninsula is depicted with careful detail. For a map created decades before Portuguese caravels rounded the Cape of Good Hope, this level of accuracy concerning lands halfway across the globe is nothing short of astonishing. So how did this knowledge reach Korea? The answer lies in the vibrant exchange of the Mongol Empire, which at its height created a single political space stretching from the Pacific to the Black Sea. Within this vast domain, scholars, diplomats, and merchants moved with unprecedented freedom. Islamic astronomers and cartographers, heirs to a golden age of science, were employed in Chinese observatories. Their maps and globes, which depicted the world based on centuries of Arab trade and travel from Spain to Indonesia, became prized objects of study. The Kangnido is a physical snapshot of that moment of fusion, a testament to a pan-Eurasian awareness that flourished long before the age of European exploration. This map fundamentally challenges a persistent narrative that advanced global geography was a Western invention. It reveals instead a medieval world where sophisticated geographic understanding was a shared project, with critical contributions flowing from Baghdad and Samarkand to Beijing and Seoul. The Kangnido does not show blank spaces waiting to be discovered by others. It shows a world already connected by lines of knowledge, if not always by direct travel. It asks us to widen our historical lens and recognize that the map of human discovery was being drawn by many hands, in many scriptoria, looking out from many different centers of the world. And if such detailed knowledge of Africa and Europe could be etched onto silk in Korea in the early 1400s, it compels us to look directly at the source, to the cartographers of the Islamic world whose charts made this all possible. King Roger II of Sicily presided over a court where the world's knowledge was not divided, but woven together. In the 12th century, this Norman ruler commissioned a project of breathtaking ambition to create a definitive description of the entire known world. To lead it, he chose a brilliant Muslim scholar, Al-Idrisi, who had traveled from North Africa. For 15 years, Al-Idrisi and a team of researchers interviewed merchants, studied sailors' logs, and pored over texts in Arabic, Greek, and Latin. The result was not just a book, but a massive silver planisphere, a disk of the world, and an accompanying text called the Tabula Rogeriana. While the original silver disk is lost, the circular world maps copied from it survive, and they present a vision that feels both familiar and alien. True to the Islamic cartographic tradition, they are oriented with south at the top, but this shift in perspective reveals their genius, not their oddity. Look closely at the Indian Ocean. Here, Al-Idrisi depicts it not as a closed sea, but as open, connecting seamlessly around Africa to the Atlantic. This was a radical and correct insight, contradicting the ancient Ptolemaic view of a landlocked Indian Ocean. Even more striking is his treatment of the Nile. While European maps would fumble with the river's origins for centuries more, Al-Idrisi's work shows its sources with relative accuracy, drawing from the reports of traders who had ventured deep into Africa. For 300 years, this map remained the most advanced representation of the world in existence, a fusion of direct empirical observation and the refined classical tradition preserved by Arab scholars. Its legacy is a direct bridge. When the European Renaissance began to stir, it was often through portals like the court of Sicily, where works like the Tabula Rogeriana had been carefully kept. The maps that guided Columbus and da Gama did not emerge from a vacuum. They were the intellectual grandchildren of Al-Idrisi's great synthesis. This map forces a quiet correction to our historical memory, reminding us that the light of learning during Europe's so-called Dark Ages was shining brilliantly elsewhere, meticulously preserving and expanding upon the maps of antiquity. And those classical maps themselves hold secrets, for they depict a world that the Romans knew, but that later generations would completely forget. For centuries, the world was a book written in Greek, and its most authoritative chapter was penned by a man who had never left his library in Alexandria. In the 2nd century, Claudius Ptolemy compiled his Geographia, a work of staggering ambition that sought to map the entire known world using a grid of longitude and latitude. The original maps are lost, but the text, with its thousands of coordinates for cities, mountains, and rivers, provided a mathematical skeleton for the Earth. When this manuscript was rediscovered and translated into Latin in the early 1500s, it did not merely inform European cartography, it completely overwrote it. Here was the clean, logical system of the ancient world, a vision of order that swept away the messy, folklore-filled medieval maps. Printers rushed to produce beautiful new editions, filling in Ptolemy's coordinates with lavish illustrations of continents. Yet these maps were, in a profound sense, ghosts. They depicted the world not as it was in the age of Columbus, but as it had been known to Roman merchants over 1,000 years earlier. Asia stretched far further east than it truly does, and the Indian Ocean was shown as a landlocked sea, with a great southern continent walling it off from the Atlantic. This was the map's central paradox. Its rigorous geometry gave explorers the confidence to plan long voyages, while its fundamental errors actively misdirected them. Why would a navigator trust an ancient scholar over the evidence of his own eyes? The answer lies in the immense weight of classical authority. Ptolemy was not just a mapmaker, he was the supreme scientific mind of antiquity. To contradict him was to contradict reason itself. So when Portuguese sailors like Bartolomeu Dias finally rounded the tip of Africa in 1488, proving the Indian Ocean was open, they did not see it as disproving Ptolemy, but as completing him. They had found the southern passage his logic had suggested must exist. This adherence shaped the very goal of exploration, for if Asia was as vast as Ptolemy showed, then sailing west to reach it seemed a hopelessly long journey. It was this miscalculation, based on ancient data, that made Columbus' proposal to cross the Atlantic seem so recklessly ambitious, and his eventual landfall so confusing, for he believed he had reached the Indies that Ptolemy had placed just where they should be. The Ptolemaic maps teach us that knowledge is not just a tool, it is also a cage. They show how a framework can be so beautiful and so complete that it becomes difficult to see the world outside its lines. For over a millennium, the classical view imprisoned geography in a past glory, yet that same vision, once rediscovered, provided the very structure that made systematic exploration possible. It is a reminder that we often use old maps to navigate new worlds, even when they lead us to shores they never intended to chart. And this raises a haunting possibility. What if the knowledge Ptolemy himself compiled was not the beginning, but merely a copy of something far older? Ptolemy's library may have held the echoes of lost knowledge, but we must travel even further back, to a time when the world was first drawn in wet clay. In a museum in London rests a small, cracked tablet from ancient Babylon, dated to the 6th century before the Common Era. It is one of the oldest known maps of the world. The image is simple, a circle. At its heart, a rectangle labeled Babylon. Around it, a ring of water named the Bitter River. Beyond that, at the edges of the disk, a series of triangular shapes are marked, regions like Urartu and Assyria. This is not a map for travel, it is a map of the mind. It does not show distances or trade routes, it presents a complete cosmological order. Babylon is literally the center of the universe, protected by its divine rivers, with distant lands relegated to the mysterious periphery. For the Babylonians, geography was not separate from myth and theology. It was their physical expression. The map answered fundamental questions: where do we stand in creation, and what lies beyond the waters of order? It served a symbolic and administrative purpose, likely used to teach scribes about the empire's place in a cosmos governed by gods. This ancient artifact forces a profound shift in our perspective. We often judge old maps by their navigational accuracy, but for many cultures that was never the point. A map could be a prayer, a statement of power, a diagram of sacred space. The unknown regions were not blank spaces waiting for data. They were realms of legend inhabited by monsters or gods, and drawing them at the edge of the world was a way of defining civilization itself against the chaos. This symbolic approach is not primitive, it is foundational. It reveals the deep human need to not just chart the land, but to understand our place within it. Every culture creates its own center and draws its own bitter river at the border of the known. The Babylonian World Map is a whisper from the dawn of cartography, reminding us that before we could map the earth, we first had to imagine it. And from this symbolic beginning, a different kind of precision would emerge, not from the river valleys of Mesopotamia, but from the islands of the Pacific, where people were navigating an ocean vast beyond imagining using maps made of sticks and shells. A cracked piece of papyrus from a tomb in Thebes holds not a prayer for the afterlife, but a set of directions to a quarry. Dated to around 1,150 years before the Common Era, the Turin papyrus map is a stunning anomaly. While Babylonian scribes were drawing the world as a symbolic disk, and centuries before Greek philosophers would theorize a spherical earth, an Egyptian surveyor was creating something remarkably modern, a practical, topographic map for a mining expedition. This fragile document, likely prepared for a royal mission into the Wadi Hammamat region of the eastern desert, charts a 15-kilometer stretch of dry riverbed leading to a prized stone quarry. It is not a spiritual diagram but a working tool. The map notes distances between hills, marks the location of the quarry itself, and even uses different colored inks to distinguish between the gravel beds of the wadi and the surrounding mountain ranges of dark, metamorphic stone. Most astonishingly, it includes hieratic text labels that are not poetic but purely descriptive, noting where the rocks are good for making statues and where a well is located. This is cartography stripped of myth, a functional document for resource extraction. Its very existence answers a question we rarely ask about the ancient world. How did they manage such complex logistics? How did a pharaoh's architect know where to send hundreds of workers to haul back tons of precious Bekan stone for sculptures and sarcophagi? The Turin map provides the answer with a clarity that feels shockingly contemporary. It reveals a society that employed spatial reasoning and precise observation for economic and state purposes. This sophisticated understanding of terrain and distance, achieved millennia before magnetic compasses or accurate timekeeping, forces us to expand our definition of ancient science. Mapmaking was not solely for kings contemplating their empire or priests charting the heavens. It was also for the foreman leading a team into the desert, a rolled papyrus in hand, following lines that meant water, shelter, and valuable stone. This shift from the symbolic to the practical is profound. It grounds the history of cartography in the dirt and rock of everyday human endeavor. While the great world maps asked where we are in the cosmos, the Turin papyrus asked a much more immediate question. How do we get from here to the resources we need, and how do we get them back? This terrestrial focus, however, was only one half of the story. For every civilization that mastered the land, another was learning to navigate a far more fluid and treacherous frontier, the open sea. The open ocean was a different kind of desert, one of shifting horizons and hidden dangers, and to cross it required a different kind of map, Among the possessions of a medieval Mediterranean sailor, the most precious might not have been his compass, but a rolled parchment known as a Portolan chart. These were not philosophical diagrams of the world. They were working tools for survival, drawn with a single, urgent purpose: to get a ship from one port to another without running aground. The detail is breathtaking. Coastlines are rendered with a specificity that feels almost modern, every bay, headland, and river mouth meticulously recorded, as if seen from the crow's nest. The parchment is crisscrossed with a web of lines radiating from ornate compass roses, a spiderweb of room lines that allowed a navigator to plot a constant bearing across open water. These charts were the accumulated, hard-won knowledge of generations of pilots, passed down and refined in the dim light of ships' cabins. Yet, look to the edges of these practical documents, out into the Atlantic Ocean beyond the Pillars of Hercules, and something strange happens. Among the accurately drawn coasts of Iberia and North Africa, the cartographer's pen would often add islands that have never existed: Antillia, a large rectangular landmass, or the elusive St. Brendan's Isle, a place of monastic legend. This seems like a contradiction. How could a map so precise in one area be so fanciful in another? The answer lies in the nature of maritime knowledge itself. For a sailor, an empty space on a chart was not an invitation for speculation. It was a professional hazard. A captain needed to know what was not there as much as what was. So, these phantom islands served a dual purpose. Some were indeed legends, stories of holy lands or lost kingdoms that provided a narrative for the terrifying void of the ocean. But others may have been something far more intriguing: encrypted records of actual lands, seen once in a storm or stumbled upon by a ship blown off course, and then kept as a closely guarded trade secret. Marking them on a chart, even in a distorted or mythical form, was a way for a cartographic guild to preserve that intelligence without giving it away to rivals. The Catalan Atlas of 1375, a magnificent multi-panel world map built upon Portolan techniques, embodies this duality perfectly. Its depiction of the Mediterranean is a masterpiece of empirical observation, while its Atlantic stretches are populated with illustrated kings, exotic animals, and those mysterious islands. It was a bridge between the known world of trade and the whispered world of possibility. This tradition represents the crucial pivot in European cartography, the moment when mapmaking began its slow turn from a blend of scripture and speculation toward a discipline based on measurement and repeatable experience. The Portolan charts ask us to reconsider what we mean by accuracy. For the sailor clinging to the rail in a gale, a chart that marked a rumored reef or a potential landfall, even under a mythical name, was more accurate, more true to the perilous reality of his journey than a blank space ever could be. These stained and weathered parchments were not just maps of the sea, they were maps of human confidence and fear, charting the very edge of the known. And it was from this tradition of coded secrets and coastal precision that the next great leap would be attempted, not to chart a familiar sea, but to outline the vast, echoing expanse of an entire ocean. Portolan charts were guides for navigating known waters, but one map dared to draw the entire shape of the unknown. In the small German town of St. Dieppe in 1507, a scholar named Martin Waldseemüller was assembling a radical new vision of the world. His large wall map, printed from 12 separate woodblocks, did something no other published map had done before. In the southern hemisphere of this vast new land, he printed a name: America. He chose it to honor the Florentine explorer Amerigo Vespucci, whose published letters argued convincingly that the lands reached by Columbus were not the outskirts of Asia, but an entirely new continent, a mundus novus. This was a monumental shift in thought, and Waldseemüller gave it a permanent label, but the naming was not the map's only act of foresight. Look at its western edge. There, between the coast of this new America and the coast of Asia, Waldseemüller drew a vast, empty ocean. He labeled it Mare Pacificum, the peaceful sea. This depiction is astonishing because in 1507, no European had yet seen this ocean from the American side. Vasco Núñez de Balboa would not make his famous trek across the Isthmus of Panama and sight the Pacific for another 6 years. Ferdinand Magellan's fleet would not sail into it for another 12. So how did Waldseemüller know it was there? The map itself offers a clue in its title, Universalis Cosmographia. It was a cosmography, a synthesis of all available knowledge. Waldseemüller and his collaborator, Ringman, had access to the latest reports from Portuguese and Spanish voyages, which were state secrets. They also studied Vespucci's accounts intensely. By connecting these dots, they made a brilliant deduction. If this was a new continent blocking the westward route to Asia, then there must be another ocean on its other side to reach those fabled Spice Islands. The map is a testament to the power of reasoned geography, of piecing together a puzzle even when a central piece was still missing. Yet its accuracy is haunting. It shows a continuous coastline from North to South America, with a narrow isthmus in Central America, and it correctly separates this new world from Asia by that enormous sea. For a brief moment, this map presented a world that was almost perfectly configured, a vision that would take explorers another century to physically confirm. Then, curiously, Waldseemüller himself seemed to back away from his own insight. In later maps, he removed the name America and reverted to more conservative models. It was as if the truth had flashed before him, too brilliant and too radical to sustain. But the genie was out of the bottle, the name stuck, and the map's logic prevailed. This single sheet of paper captures the precise instant when Europe's geographical understanding clicked into a new and lasting shape. It asks us, when does a name become a reality? Waldseemüller did not discover a continent, but by naming it, he helped solidify its existence in the European mind, separating it forever from the old dreams of Asia. His map stands as a monument to a moment of brilliant predictive error, a wrong assumption about Vespucci's role that led to a fundamentally right understanding of the world. And this act of naming one mystery continent invites us to look south, to where mapmakers were trying to name and claim a land that was nothing but wind, ice, and rumor. A single map could be worth a king's ransom, and in 1502, a man named Alberto Cantino proved it. He was not a cartographer, but a diplomatic agent for the Duke of Ferrara operating in Lisbon. His mission, to acquire the most closely guarded secrets of the Portuguese crown, their charts of the New World. What he managed to smuggle out of Portugal is known as the Cantino Planisphere, a stunningly beautiful and politically explosive document. It is a snapshot of the world at a pivotal moment, drawn with the ink of espionage. The map's depiction of South America is what makes it so valuable. Just 2 years after Pedro Álvares Cabral's fleet first made landfall in Brazil, this chart shows its coastline with a defined, confident curve. A thin vertical line, the line of demarcation established by the Treaty of Tordesillas, slices through the Atlantic, dividing the New World between Spain and Portugal. The map is a legal document in disguise, a visual argument for Portuguese claims. But look north into the cold waters of the North Atlantic. There, almost as an afterthought, is a rough outline of a land labeled Terra del Rei de Portugal, the land of the King of Portugal. Scholars believe this is one of the very earliest European depictions of the coast of Newfoundland, evidence that Portuguese cod fishermen may have been secretly fishing those rich banks years before any official voyage was recorded. The Cantino Planisphere reveals a truth far beyond geography. In the age of discovery, knowledge was not just power, it was territory itself. A coastline on a map was a claim. A detailed chart of currents and landmarks was a military asset. This is why such maps were state secrets. locked away in the Casa d'India with disclosure punishable by death. Cantino's successful theft shows how desperately other European powers wanted to crack the Portuguese monopoly on the route to the riches of the East and the West. The map's very existence is a testament to the cutthroat competition that fueled the Renaissance, where spies in silk robes traded in parchment instead of passwords. Its accuracy in some areas and curious vagueness in others paints a picture of a world being assembled in real time from whispered reports, sailors' logs, and the guarded confessions of returned captains. This clandestine world of stolen coastlines and secret meridians sets the stage for an even more dangerous kind of map, one that did not just challenge political boundaries, but threatened to overturn the very cosmological order sanctioned by the Church. That clandestine world of stolen maps and state secrets hints at a deeper current of knowledge, one that may have flowed into Europe much earlier than we ever suspected. In the quiet of a Venetian workshop around 1411, a cartographer named Lost de Virga completed a world map that would vanish from history, leaving only a ghost in the records. We know of it today only from a single detailed description written centuries later. According to that account, de Virga's map was a circular planisphere, a beautiful and intricate thing. But its true shock was not its artistry, but its geography. It reportedly showed the continent of Africa with a shape that was startlingly correct, a southern coastline that tapered to a point, suggesting the continent could be sailed around. This was more than 70 years before the Portuguese captain Bartolomeu Dias finally rounded the Cape of Good Hope in 1488, proving the Indian Ocean was not a landlocked lake as Ptolemy had taught, but an open highway to the east. If the description is accurate, de Virga's map was a cartographic prophecy of the highest order. How could a Venetian in the early 1400s have possessed such knowledge? The most plausible answer points not to European voyages, which had not yet reached that far south, but to the vibrant exchange of information happening across the Mediterranean. De Virga almost certainly had access to Arab sources, Islamic geographers and sailors whose trade networks stretched down the East African coast to Zanzibar and beyond, had long understood Africa's general form. Their maps and navigational guides, which circulated among scholarly circles in places like Alexandria and Sicily, carried this understanding. A cartographer like de Virga, working in a mercantile hub like Venice, a gateway between Europe and the Islamic world, could have synthesized these foreign reports with European data to produce a vision far ahead of its time. So why did this map disappear, and why did its insight fail to change the course of European exploration? This is the haunting mystery of lost knowledge. A single map, no matter how accurate, is a fragile thing. It can be destroyed in a fire, lost in a library, or simply ignored because its information contradicts the dominant belief system of the day. The Ptolemaic model, with its enclosed Indian Ocean, was not just a map, it was an article of faith backed by the immense authority of classical learning. A lone chart suggesting otherwise might have been dismissed as a curiosity, a fanciful error, or even heresy. Its loss reminds us that history is not just a record of what was discovered, but also a graveyard of what was forgotten, what was seen once and then slipped through the cracks of time. This pattern of advanced knowledge appearing and then vanishing asks a profound question. How many other maps holding other truths were drawn and then lost to war, decay, or simple neglect? The search for these lost artifacts sometimes leads not to royal libraries, but to the most mundane of places, tucked away in the pages of a book meant for everyday use. While Venetian cartographers studied African coastlines, a Danish scholar was looking north, drawing a map from the edge of the world. Claudius Clavis, working in the early 1400s, produced a depiction of the north that seems stark and simple to modern eyes, yet it was a landmark. His map provided one of the first modern, recognizable outlines of Greenland and the Nordic regions to enter the mainstream of European geography. It showed Greenland not as a vague mythical island, but as a long, slender peninsula reaching down from the Arctic, with Iceland placed with reasonable accuracy nearby. This was not a work of grand theory or classical revival. It was something far more valuable, a transmission of local, practical knowledge. Clavis almost certainly drew upon the still vibrant Norse geographical tradition, the sailing directions and coastal sketches that had been passed down through generations of Scandinavian seafarers. He may even have had access to accounts from the Norse settlements in Greenland, which, though increasingly isolated, were still inhabited in his time. His work acted as a crucial bridge, carrying precise information from the periphery of the known world directly into the heart of the European cartographic workshop. When German and Italian mapmakers like Nicolaus Germanus and Henricus Martellus later incorporated Clavis's Nordic data into their own world maps, they were doing more than just filling in a blank space. They were acknowledging that the map of the world could be built from the outside in, that knowledge collected on the icy margins could refine the image held at the center. This quietly challenges a persistent assumption that exploration was always a radiation outward from a civilized core. Here, the flow reversed. The detailed understanding of the far north, maintained by the Norse, filtered south and was synthesized by a scholar who then fed it into the broader Renaissance project. Claudius Clavis' map asks us a subtle but important question. What role did peripheral cultures, those living on the very frontiers depicted, play in shaping the central geographic narrative? Often they held the key. Their lived experience became the data that corrected the speculation of academics thousands of miles away. This Nordic contribution, etched onto parchment before Columbus sailed, reminds us that every accurate line on a map has an origin story, sometimes whispered from a longship in a frozen fjord rather than proclaimed from a royal court. And as European mapmakers began to solidify the contours of the Atlantic North, their gaze was already being pulled toward a new and vaster frontier, an ocean whose very name promised peace, but whose secrets would demand a new kind of map entirely. The maps of the North were built from local knowledge, but a chart discovered far from its home revealed a network of global scale. Tucked away in the Bodleian Library at Oxford for centuries was a large, colorful Chinese map from the late Ming Dynasty, known today as the Selden Map. Painted on fine paper around 1620, it was not a map of the Chinese Empire, but of the sea. Its focus is the vibrant, bustling maritime world of Southeast Asia, stretching from the coast of Japan all the way to the eastern coast of India. What makes it revolutionary are the delicate red lines that crisscross the blue ocean, each one marked with a detailed compass bearing and distance. These are not vague routes, but precise navigational highways, a complete diagram of the trade winds and sailing directions that powered Asia's economy. This was a working document for merchants and pilots, a Chinese Portolan chart that mapped the most lucrative trading network on the planet from a distinctly Asian vantage point. The map's very existence is a powerful corrective. It was created during a period often portrayed as one of Chinese isolation, following the end of the great treasure voyages of Admiral Zheng He. Yet here is clear evidence that the knowledge from those voyages did not vanish. It was commercialized and refined. Chinese merchants, Fujianese traders in particular, maintained an intimate, practical understanding of ports from Malacca to Manila, using charts like this to navigate a polyglot world of commerce. The Selden Map does not just show geography, it shows a system, a sophisticated economic engine running on carefully calculated maritime routes. It asks us to fundamentally reshape our view of the so-called Age of Discovery. While European powers were fighting to claim territories and establish colonial ports, this map reveals a parallel universe of Asian maritime enterprise that was older, more established, and in many ways more interconnected. It was a world built on trade relationships and shared navigational wisdom, not just conquest. The sophistication of its compass, rose and room lines proves that advanced cartographic technique was not a European monopoly. It was a tool developed wherever people needed to reliably cross vast stretches of water. This chart, sitting quietly in an English library, silently testifies to a lost chapter of globalization, one directed from the South China Sea. And if Chinese mariners possessed such detailed knowledge of the waters stretching to India, it forces a tantalizing question. What did they know about the vast, empty ocean that lay to their east, the Great Pacific? That question leads us from the detailed red lines of trade to the realm of pure speculation, and to a map that claims to show a continent no one had ever seen. A world can be mapped in gold as well as on parchment. Deep in the highlands of what is now Colombia, the Muisca civilization crafted intricate golden artifacts, not as currency but as sacred offerings. Among these are flat, rectangular plates and elaborate pendants, often showing stylized human figures surrounded by patterns of dots, lines, and geometric shapes. To a modern eye, they are beautiful works of art, but some archaeologists and anthropologists see something more: schematic diagrams of a known world. The patterns may represent the layout of sacred lakes like Lake Guatavita, the arrangement of villages across the highland plains, or even celestial pathways of the gods. These were not maps for navigation, but maps of meaning, encoding territory, social order, and cosmology into a single, luminous object. They represent a cartography of connection, where a place was not just a point in space, but a node in a web of spiritual and communal relationships. This indigenous perspective fundamentally challenges the very definition of a map. Must it have a scale, a north arrow, and coastlines to be considered geographical knowledge? The Muisca artifacts argue otherwise. They remind us that every culture develops its own language for space, a system born from its unique relationship with the land. While these golden diagrams did not depict lands unknown to Europe before their discovery, they represent something equally profound: a complete and sophisticated recognition of a world, charted and understood on its own terms, centuries before European cartographers ever drew a line for the continent of South America. Interpreting these symbols is an act of cultural translation, asking us to see geography through a different lens, one where the sacred and the terrestrial are inseparable. This tradition of encoding landscape into portable, meaningful objects was not unique to the Andes. It finds a stunning parallel across the world's greatest ocean, in a culture that mapped the sea with nothing but sticks and shells. Across the vast Pacific, a different kind of mapmaker read the ocean not with ink but with memory and motion. For the navigators of the Marshall Islands, the sea was not an empty space between points. It was a living, textured landscape full of signs. Their maps were not drawn on parchment. They were woven from the ribs of palm fronds and tied with coconut fiber, studded with small cowrie shells to mark the atolls. These are the stick charts, and they are among the most ingenious navigational tools ever devised. A stranger might see only an abstract, fragile latticework of sticks, but to a trained Marshallese navigator, this frame held the ocean itself. The curved sticks did not represent coastlines. They mapped the refraction patterns of ocean swells, the way deep, rolling waves would bend and bounce as they encountered the submerged slopes of a distant island. The shells were not decorations, they were the islands. The entire chart was a dynamic diagram of wave interference, a lesson in reading the rhythmic language of the sea. To use it, a navigator would lie in the hull of his outrigger canoe, feeling the pitch and roll of the vessel with his entire body, correlating those sensations with the patterns memorized from the chart. He was navigating by the echo of islands he could not yet see. This knowledge was not written down, it was sung, chanted in navigational schools, and passed from master to apprentice over generations. It was this profound environmental literacy that enabled one of humanity's greatest adventures, the deliberate settlement of thousands of remote Pacific islands, a feat accomplished centuries, even millennia, before European explorers arrived with their compasses and astrolabes. The stick charts force a complete redefinition of what a map can be. They are not a static snapshot of land, but a dynamic model of a relationship, a guide to the ever-changing pathways of energy across the water. They teach us that to truly know a space, you must understand its behavior, not just its shape. This fluid cartography, based on rhythm and resonance rather than fixed coordinates, represents a paradigm of knowledge as deep and as valid as any Mercator projection. It asks us, what other dimensions of the world have we failed to map because we only looked for solid ground? This mastery of the ocean's pulse hints at a vast, shared memory among Pacific cultures, a memory that may have once included lands that later vanished beneath the waves, or that were never more than the hopeful rumors of sailors who had ridden those swells to the very edge of the world. The golden stick charts of the Pacific charted a world of rhythm, but in the quiet port towns of northern France, a different kind of map was being drawn from whispers and secrets. By the middle of the 16th century, a school of master cartographers in the town of Dieppe began producing some of the most lavishly illustrated sea atlases in Europe. Among them, the Vallard Atlas of 1547 stands out for its breathtaking artistry and a profound geographic puzzle. On its panel of the East Indies, below the islands of Java and Sumatra, the mapmaker has drawn a vast, unfamiliar coastline. He labels it Jave la Grande. The shape is unmistakable to a modern eye, a long eastern shore running north to south with a deep, distinctive bite taken out of its center and a bulbous northern peninsula. It is a startlingly good match for the northern and eastern coasts of Australia. This was more than 200 years before Captain James Cook would officially chart the continent's eastern seaboard. So what exactly were the deep cartographers looking at? They were almost certainly not working from first-hand French exploration. Instead, historians believe they were copying from Portuguese source maps, charts that are now lost to history. In that era, Portuguese navigators were the undisputed masters of the eastern seas, reaching the Spice Islands and establishing trade routes. Their maps were state secrets, but through espionage, capture, or the movement of freelance pilots, fragments of that knowledge clearly leaked out. The deep maps like the Vallard, the Déceliers, and the Dauphin present Jave la Grande not as a vague mythical land, but as a real place with rivers, mountains, and even notations about the people. Some show what could be the Gulf of Carpentaria, others hint at the Great Barrier Reef. The detail is too specific, too coherent to be pure guesswork. This suggests a startling possibility that Portuguese caravels, or perhaps ships from other nations in Portuguese employ, may have coasted along the northern shores of this great southern land in the early 1500s, mapping it in secret to protect their trade advantage. The secrecy was so effective that the knowledge nearly died with the charts themselves, surviving only in these beautiful French copies. The mystery of Jave la Grande does not end with Europe, however. Could the Portuguese have gotten their information from even earlier sources? There are persistent, though difficult to prove, theories of Asian contact from Chinese treasure fleets or Makassar fishermen from Indonesia, who may have visited the northern coasts for centuries to harvest sea cucumber. Did a Portuguese captain acquire a local chart or a description from a Javanese or Malay pilot, and then transpose that information onto a European-style map? The deep maps sit at the intersection of these tantalizing threads, a cartographic echo of voyages that left no other record. They ask us to hold two ideas in our minds at once, that a continent can be truly discovered many times by many cultures, and that the official record of history is often just the last, loudest voice in a long conversation that happened in whispers. This southern enigma, a continent half seen and then forgotten, naturally pulls our gaze further south into the coldest and most mysterious waters on Earth, where the maps themselves seem to strain against the very edge of the world. The legend of Jave la Grande whispered of a southern land, but a more famous cartographer would give that rumor a definitive name and shape. In 1538, a young Gerardus Mercator, decades before he devised his famous navigational projection, published his first world map. It is a fascinating snapshot of a mind in formation, a blend of cutting-edge science and enduring myth. Dominating the southern hemisphere is a massive, sprawling continent labeled Terra Australis. It is not a vague suggestion, but a detailed landmass with capes, gulfs, and rivers connected to South America and stretching below Africa and Asia. More intriguing than the continent itself is a small note tucked near its coast. Mercator writes that this land was recently discovered by the Portuguese, though it is not yet fully known. This is not an artist's flourish, it is a citation. Mercator, even at this early stage, was operating as a master compiler, a clearinghouse for every scrap of geographic intelligence he could acquire from sailors, scholars, and stolen Portuguese Portolan charts. His notation is a rare, overt admission of the secret knowledge flowing beneath the surface of official exploration. What Portuguese caravel on a clandestine mission south of the Cape of Good Hope might have sighted these shores? Or was this note based on a misinterpreted report from the East Indies, perhaps a confused account of Australia itself? Mercator did not invent this southern continent. He was synthesizing a belief that went back to the ancient Greeks, but by attaching it to a contemporary Portuguese discovery, he lent the myth the weight of modern evidence. This early map reveals the cartographic process in its raw form, a constant sifting of data where hard-won fact and persistent legend were woven together on the same parchment. The true challenge for a scholar like Mercator was not drawing the lines but vetting the sources. How could he tell a sailor's tall tale from a genuine pilot's log? The answer often lay in consistency. If multiple, independent sources from different nations described a similar coastline, it gained credibility. This compilation practice, this relentless cross-referencing of secrets, is what makes maps from this era so tantalizing. They are not single narratives but palimpsests of global gossip. Mercator's own work would evolve dramatically, his later maps becoming models of technical precision for navigation, yet even they sometimes retained echoes of these early mysteries. His 1538 map captures a specific moment in the history of knowledge, a moment when the world's last great unknown could still be drawn with the confidence of a rumor, its blank spaces filled not with the void of ignorance, but with the vibrant, problematic promise of things just beyond the horizon. This practice of compiling anomalies, however, would reach its most extreme expression in a chart that seemed to throw all caution to the wind, a map that dared to depict a civilization many believe existed only in legend. The southern continent on Mercator's map was a theory, but one of his contemporaries claimed to draw it from life. In 1531, the same year he drew his heart-shaped world, the French cartographer Oronce Finé produced another map, a cordiform projection focused on the South Pole. Here, the landmass labeled Terra Australis is not a vague outline, it is shockingly specific. It shows a continent largely free of ice, with deep inlets, broad river systems flowing from a central mountain range, and a coastline that suggests familiar bays and peninsulas. The detail is so precise that it seems less like a speculative guess and more like a tracing of an actual coastline. This is the Orontius Phineus map of Antarctica, and it presents a riddle that chills the blood. How could a scholar in 16th century Paris possibly know what lay beneath 2 miles of glacial ice, a truth that would not be revealed by modern seismic surveys for over 400 years? The features he drew bear a startling, and to some researchers, an unsettling resemblance to the subglacial topography of the real Antarctica. The rivers on his map align with what are now known as subglacial valleys, and the mountain ranges correspond to actual uplifts buried under the ice sheet. This cannot be explained by lucky guesswork. The most compelling theory is that Finé, like Piri Reis 2 decades earlier, was working from a much older source map, a chart that depicted Antarctica not as a frozen wasteland, but as a temperate, habitable land. This idea immediately pulls us into the realm of radical Earth history. When was Antarctica last ice-free? Mainstream geology tells us the continent has been under its present ice cap for millions of years, long before any known human civilization could have mapped it. This creates an impossible gap between the evidence of the map and the accepted timeline of human development. Some researchers, looking at this and the Piri Reis chart together, propose a dramatic alternative, that an advanced seafaring culture existed in a remote prehistoric epoch during a warm period when Antarctica's coasts were green. This civilization, the theory goes, explored and mapped the world, and fragments of their cartography survived through copies of copies, eventually falling into the hands of Renaissance scholars. It is a captivating story, one that speaks to our deepest fascination with lost worlds and forgotten golden ages. Mainstream scholars offer more conservative explanations, suggesting Finé might have been piecing together misunderstood reports from southern voyages, conflating the tip of South America with a mythical southern land. They argue that the apparent accuracy could be a coincidence born from the limited ways a coastline can be drawn. Yet the specificity of the inland details, the rivers and mountains where no European had ever been, makes coincidence feel like a thin explanation. The map forces a confrontation with the concept of catastrophic Earth changes. What if our planet's climate has not always been as stable as we believe? Could there have been a relatively recent, rapid shift that encased a recognizable continent in ice, erasing all but the cartographic memory of its former self? This polar mystery does not give us easy answers, but it does something more important. It challenges the boundaries of our historical imagination. It asks us to hold two conflicting truths in balance: the solid evidence of the parchment and the immense, silent testimony of the ice. The map is a question mark drawn at the bottom of the world, a persistent whisper that the past may be deeper and stranger than our textbooks can contain. The idea of a lost polar civilization is a grand and haunting one, but it began not with ancient mariners but with a modern professor. In the 1960s, a historian named Charles Hapgood looked at the Piri Reis and Oronce Finé maps and saw not isolated curiosities, but pieces of a single shattered puzzle. He proposed a radical thesis which he called the theory of the ancient sea kings. Hapgood argued that these maps, and others like them, were medieval copies of far older source charts, created by a sophisticated, global civilization that existed thousands of years before recorded history. This forgotten culture, he believed, possessed nautical technology and geographic knowledge rivaling that of the 18th century, and they mapped the entire world, including the ice-free coasts of Antarctica. To explain how that continent could later become frozen, Hapgood turned to an even more dramatic idea: crustal displacement. This theory suggests that the Earth's outer shell can shift as a whole over the molten core, moving entire continents to different latitudes in a relatively short geological time. In this scenario, Antarctica was once located in a more temperate zone, was mapped by these ancient explorers, and then catastrophically slid to its current polar position, locking it in ice and erasing all but the cartographic memory of its explorers. Mainstream geology and archaeology firmly reject this model, citing a lack of physical evidence for such a recent, rapid shift or for a global prehistoric civilization of that technological scale. The scientific consensus holds that the ice cap is millions of years old, yet Hapgood's work, while controversial, forces a crucial and enduring question about the maps themselves. If his grand explanation is not correct, then what are we to make of the specific, seemingly anachronistic data they contain? How do fragments of accurate geographic information, like the shape of a continent or the course of a river, end up on a parchment drawn centuries before that information was supposedly available? This is the core of the historical mystery. It asks us to separate the evidence from the explanation. We can dismiss Hapgood's overarching theory while still taking the maps seriously as artifacts that challenge a simple, linear narrative of discovery. Perhaps the answer is less dramatic than lost civilizations and shifting poles, but no less fascinating. It may lie in the incredible, slow-motion relay race of human knowledge. A Portuguese sailor hears a story from a Malay pilot who learned it from a Chinese trader whose ancestors may have acquired a scrap of information from an Arab dhow captain, who in turn referenced a Greek text saved in an Alexandrian library, which was itself a copy of a Phoenician trader's log. Over millennia, a coastline could be transmitted, distorted, and yet preserved, its origin story utterly lost but its outline stubbornly accurate. Hapgood's theory, for all its scientific problems, serves a vital purpose. It pushes us to look beyond easy answers and to sit with the discomfort of an anomaly. It reminds us that the past is not a neatly solved equation, but a landscape littered with fragments that do not always fit. Distinguishing between speculative theory and genuine historical puzzle requires a careful balance, a willingness to follow the evidence wherever it leads, while also acknowledging the limits of what a single piece of parchment can prove. This grand, sweeping hypothesis ultimately directs our attention away from global cataclysms and back to the human scale, to smaller, more tangible artifacts that are puzzling in their own right. Sometimes a story is not found on parchment, but in the pages of a newspaper. On April 5, 1909, the Arizona Gazette published a front-page article that read like a novel. It described an expedition funded by the Smithsonian Institution, led by a Professor S.A. Jordan, which had made a staggering discovery within a vast, labyrinthine cave system in the Grand Canyon. The report claimed the team found artifacts resembling those from Egypt and even Tibet, including copper tools and ceramic vessels. Most astonishing of all was the centerpiece of their find, a large stone tablet, a map. This was no ordinary chart, but one that allegedly depicted the Colorado River and its tributaries with an accuracy that suggested intimate, ancient knowledge of the canyon's geography. The article proposed a radical idea that this was evidence of a pre-Columbian civilization, possibly travelers from across the Pacific, who had settled in North America and left their mark deep within the earth. The story ignited the public imagination, then vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. No official records from the Smithsonian supported the expedition. Professor Jordan could not be traced. No artifacts or photographs ever surfaced. To historians and archaeologists, the case was closed almost immediately, a classic example of yellow journalism, a hoax designed to sell papers in an era hungry for tales of lost cities and ancient mysteries. Yet the story of the Grand Canyon map refuses to die. It persists in books, documentaries, and online forums, a stubborn legend in the shadow of one of America's greatest natural wonders. Why does this particular tale, so easily debunked by experts, hold such power? It speaks directly to a deep and enduring human desire, the longing to find a hidden chapter, a secret layer of history waiting just beneath the surface of the familiar. The Grand Canyon itself, with its monumental layers of rock revealing billions of years, feels like the perfect setting for such a revelation. If the Earth can hold such geological secrets, why not historical ones? The story cleverly combines two potent myths: the idea of a lost civilization on the North American continent, like the fabled cities of Cibola sought by Spanish conquistadors, and the theory of transoceanic contact long before Columbus. It offers a tangible artifact, a map, as proof. This reflects a pattern we have seen again and again, from the Zeno map to the tales of Terra Australis. When faced with the vast unknown, we are compelled to fill it not with silence but with narrative. A blank space on a map or a dark passage in a canyon becomes a canvas for our deepest curiosities and our most romantic notions about the past. The 1909 newspaper article is not a historical document, but a cultural artifact in its own right. It shows how maps, even fictional ones, function as keys, promising to unlock doors to forgotten worlds. While this story belongs to the realm of legend, it prepares us to examine maps that are undeniably real, yet whose true purpose and meaning have been shrouded in just as much mystery, waiting for the right key to turn. The greatest map of the Amazon was not drawn on paper, but written in the journal of a Dominican friar. In 1542, Gaspar de Carvajal accompanied a desperate Spanish expedition led by Francisco de Orellana, the first Europeans to travel the entire length of the mighty river. Carvajal's chronicle is a tale of hardship and wonder, but one passage in particular would echo through the centuries. He described passing large settlements that stretched for miles along the riverbank, towns with wide roads and plazas, ruled by powerful female warriors he called Amazons. He wrote of seeing glints of gold and silver, and of communities so populous that the sound of their drums filled the jungle for days. For the exhausted, starving men, it was a vision of civilization in the heart of the green unknown. Yet when later expeditions retraced their route, armed with Carvajal's account as their guide, they found nothing but dense, uninterrupted forest. No cities, no roads, no warrior queens. The prosperous kingdoms had vanished. This discrepancy gave birth to one of history's most enduring legends, El Dorado, the golden city hidden in the jungle. Carvajal's words had created a cartographic myth more powerful than any parchment. His descriptions functioned as a verbal map, plotting points of desire rather than points of geography. They guided not with compass bearings but with promises. Every Spanish and Portuguese explorer who plunged into the Amazon for the next 200 years carried this mental map, this expectation of gleaming cities just beyond the next bend in the river. Their own maps began to reflect this belief, often showing a large mythical lake, Lake Parime, in the Guiana highlands, from which El Dorado was said to rule. The search reshaped the actual mapping of the continent, driving expeditions into impossible terrain and adding phantom landmarks that persisted on maps well into the 18th century. So was Friar Carvajal lying, perhaps not intentionally. His account may have been a mixture of desperate hope, genuine misinterpretation, and the reality of a landscape that was already changing. Modern archaeology suggests the Amazon before European contact was far from an untouched wilderness. There is evidence of large, complex societies that practiced sophisticated agriculture and built extensive earthworks. These communities, however, were devastatingly vulnerable to Old World illnesses, which raced ahead of the explorers themselves. What Orellana's group may have witnessed were the last thriving days of a civilization already beginning to collapse from introduced diseases, a collapse that was complete by the time the next Europeans arrived. Carvajal's map, then, was a snapshot of a world in its final moments, a written record of a reality that was disappearing even as he described it. His chronicle teaches us that a map can be a record of loss as much as a guide to discovery. It shows how narrative can fossilize a single moment in time, turning a fleeting glimpse into a permanent destination in the human imagination. A destination countless souls would spend their lives searching for but would never truly find. This power of the story map to create realities that drive men forward finds a dark counterpart in the deliberate use of cartography, not to reveal, but to conceal and control. These persistent errors on the map speak to a deeper truth about the age of sail. For centuries, the vast Atlantic was not just a body of water, it was a canvas for projection, where every strange log sighting or distant cloud bank could solidify into a new coastline. Among the most famous of these cartographic ghosts was the Isle of Demons, often placed off the coast of Newfoundland. It was not drawn as a paradise, but as a place of terror, marked with illustrations of winged creatures tormenting any sailor who dared approach. This was more than a navigational warning. It was a story, a way to explain the harsh, unforgiving nature of the northern seas and the very real perils of isolation and hardship that awaited a shipwrecked crew. The Phantom Island gave a name and a shape to the collective fear of the unknown. Similarly, the island of Friesland, which we encountered in the Zeno narrative, stubbornly refused to disappear from maps for over a century, even diverting major expeditions. Its persistence reveals a fascinating psychological mechanism. Once a feature was inscribed by a respected cartographer, it gained the weight of authority. To remove it was an act of doubt, requiring definitive proof of its absence, which was often harder to obtain than proof of its existence. You could not prove a negative in an ocean that vast. So these islands lived on, copied from chart to chart, their fictional shores becoming waypoints in the minds of navigators. They teach us that the map is never a perfect mirror of the world. It is a conversation between observation and expectation, between what is seen and what is believed must be there. The blank spaces were psychologically intolerable, so they were filled with the stuff of dreams and nightmares. This ingrained acceptance of error, this willingness to let fiction guide the compass, set the stage for a far more deliberate kind of deception. It prepared the European mind for maps that were not just mistaken, but were crafted to be unreadable to all but a chosen few, transforming geography into a cipher for power and profit. A priest's quiet life in a remote French village became the seed for one of the 20th century's most intricate historical puzzles. In the 1890s, Father Berenger Saunière began a sudden and lavish renovation of his humble church in Rennes-le-Château, funded by a source he never fully explained. The legend that grew from this mystery claims he discovered hidden parchments sealed within a hollow pillar during the restoration. These documents were not simple texts, but complex ciphers featuring odd genealogical trees, snippets of Latin, and most intriguingly, curious little maps. The maps were not of continents or oceans, but of the local landscape itself, marked with cryptic symbols and seemingly pointing to specific locations in the rugged hills surrounding the village. The narrative woven around these scraps of parchment is a masterful tapestry, connecting threads from the fall of the Visigoth kingdom through the suppressed history of the Knights Templar, and culminating in a secret so explosive it could challenge religious institutions. The treasure hinted at was not merely gold, but something far more volatile, perhaps the lost lineage of a sacred bloodline or the hidden resting place of a revered religious figure. While serious scholars and even the French government have largely dismissed the parchments as part of an elaborate hoax, possibly fabricated by Saunière himself to generate funds, the story's endurance is a cultural phenomenon. It shows how a map, especially one shrouded in code and attached to a dramatic backstory, can transcend its physical form to become a powerful narrative engine. It invites the viewer to become a detective, to feel that with enough cleverness and historical knowledge, they too could crack the code and uncover a truth hidden for centuries. This is the ultimate allure of the conspiratorial map. It democratizes the search for hidden knowledge, making every amateur historian a potential hero in their own adventure story. The Rennes-le-Château mystery, popularized by books and documentaries, asks us why we are so irresistibly drawn to these cartographic riddles. Perhaps it is because they offer a tantalizing alternative to the messy, incomplete record of conventional history. They propose a world where the past is not a collection of accidents, but a deliberate puzzle left for the worthy to solve, where every line on a map is a deliberate clue rather than a simple representation of geography. This deep human desire to find patterns and secrets in the landscape leads us directly to the final, and perhaps most important, stage of our journey: the modern tools we now use to interrogate these ancient documents, separating artistic flourish from genuine, inexplicable data. Satellites now orbit where ancient cartographers once gazed at the stars, and their silent eyes are changing how we see the past. The detective work of unraveling these map mysteries has entered a new era, one defined not by dusty archives alone, but by spectral imaging and algorithmic precision. Consider a researcher in a lab, not with a magnifying glass, but with a camera that sees in wavelengths invisible to the human eye. By bathing a parchment like the Vinland Map in different types of light, they can analyze the chemical composition of its ink without damaging a single fiber. They are looking for the spectral fingerprint of modern compounds, a telltale sign of forgery, or conversely, for the expected decay patterns of medieval materials. This is not guesswork, it is forensic archaeology. Similarly, the technique of georeferencing allows historians to take a digital scan of an ancient coastline and stretch it, bend it, and overlay it onto a modern satellite map of the world. They can quantify with mathematical certainty how closely a 500-year-old depiction aligns with reality, separating the skilled estimation from the impossibly accurate. This process has been applied to Portolan charts of the Mediterranean, revealing that some were accurate to within a few miles, a feat that seems to defy the navigational tools of their time. The question shifts from "is this possible?" to "how did they do it?" Technology provides a new language for these old arguments, turning subjective debates about a line's shape into objective data about its deviation. It allows us to isolate the signal from the noise. When we look at the curious bulge of Brazil on the Kangnido planisphere, georeferencing can show us it is not a simple error, but a consistent distortion seen in other Portuguese charts, suggesting a systematic error in their method of calculating longitude, a shared secret of their school of navigation. This analytical lens does more than validate or debunk, it reconstructs lost methodologies. It lets us peer over the shoulder of the cartographer, understanding the tools and the limitations that guided their hand. We begin to see the map not as a final statement, but as a frozen moment in a process of iterative learning, a best available version of the truth based on the reports, rumors, and measurements that had reached the workshop by a certain Tuesday in 1520. So how is 21st century science rewriting the story of 15th century discovery? It is not handing down simple verdicts of real or fake. Instead, it is revealing the astonishing sophistication of pre-modern knowledge systems, while also pinpointing the exact moments where legend bled into the survey. It shows us that the accuracy we find so shocking was often hard-won, built from countless voyages and the careful collation of experience, while the errors were not mere ignorance but logical conclusions drawn from incomplete data. This technological scrutiny ultimately refocuses our attention away from the parchment itself and back onto the human mind that created it. The maps were never about the land alone, they were about the ambition to comprehend it. That same impulse to fill a blank space is not a flaw of the past, but a fundamental trait of the human mind. From the Babylonian scribe drawing a bitter river at the edge of his clay disk to the modern scientist plotting the topography of an alien planet, we are driven by a profound need to impose order on chaos. A map in its purest form is an act of defiance against the unknown. It is a declaration that here, on this parchment or this screen, the formless becomes formed, the trackless gains a path. This psychological drive explains the phantom islands and the speculative continents that adorned so many ancient charts. They were not always lies or mistakes. Often, they were placeholders for wonder, narrative anchors in a sea of terrifying emptiness. To leave a space truly blank was to admit a limit to knowledge, to power, and to story. So the cartographer drew the Isle of Demons to give a name to maritime fear, and sketched the vastness of Terra Australis to satisfy a classical belief in a balanced, symmetrical world. These features fulfilled a deep need for cognitive completeness. The map had to tell a whole story, even if parts of that story were woven from hope, rumor, or philosophical necessity. They served a dual purpose as practical tools for those navigating known waters, and as engines of imagination for those dreaming of what lay beyond. Understanding this impulse allows us to view these ancient documents with clearer eyes. We are not looking at simple errors or cryptic prophecies. We are looking at expressions of the human condition, our fear of the void, our hunger for narrative, our audacious desire to comprehend the entire world within a single frame. This need shapes our perception of history profoundly. It reminds us that discovery is never a purely objective act of finding what is there. It is also a subjective act of seeking what we believe must be there. Every explorer, from Leif Erikson to the directors of the Mars rover program, carries a mental map of expectations, a landscape of questions shaped by the maps that came before. The speculative coastlines of old guided ships just as surely as accurate ones did, because they guided ambition. They set the destination for curiosity itself. So when we hold a parchment that shows a land not yet found, we are holding a piece of someone's courage, their anxiety, and their unwavering need to make the world make sense. This reflection on our innate cartographic instinct brings us to the final, unifying thread in this tapestry of 30 maps, a single question that has quietly underpinned every mystery we have explored. That final, unifying thread is a question of perspective. Who precisely is doing the discovering? For every coastline drawn by a European hand from second-hand reports, there were people already living there for whom that land was not unknown but home. This brings us to the 30th and perhaps most important map in our collection, one that is not drawn on parchment but inscribed in memory and oral tradition. It is the ethical dimension of rediscovery itself. Each time we marvel at an ancient chart that seems to predict a continent, we must pause and reframe the language. Discovery by whom? To the indigenous cultures of the Americas, of Australia, of the Pacific Islands. Their homelands were not discovered in the 15th or 16th centuries. They were known, named, and deeply understood for millennia. The Kangnido map showed Europe from a Korean viewpoint. The stick charts of the Marshall Islands mapped ocean swells with genius. The Muisca golden artifacts encoded their sacred landscape. These were all sophisticated systems of geographical knowledge, operating entirely outside the European tradition. When a Portuguese chart shows a rough outline of Brazil, it is documenting, however imperfectly, a land that the Tupi, the Guarani, and countless other nations knew intimately. The map captures a moment of external recognition, not the moment of creation. This reframing is not about diminishing the intrigue of these artifacts, but about deepening our respect for the full story. The mystery is not that the land existed before Europeans knew of it. The deeper mystery is how fragments of indigenous knowledge, filtered through traders, captives, or chance encounters, made their way across the world and onto these parchments. The Zeno map may contain whispers of Norse encounters with indigenous North Americans. The deep maps of Jave la Grande likely hold echoes of Aboriginal Australian shores as described by Malay or Portuguese intermediaries. These maps become palimpsests of cultural contact, often unrecorded and uncredited. Balancing our fascination with the cartographic puzzle with respect for these deep histories requires a subtle shift. We can still wonder at the Piri Reis map's strange coastline while acknowledging that if it shows an ice-free Antarctica, it hints at a prehistoric human story far older than any admiral's chart. We can debate the Vinland map while centering the fact that the Norse sagas themselves describe encounters with the people they called Skraelings, the indigenous inhabitants of Vinland. The ethical approach enriches the mystery, it does not erase it. It asks us to listen for the faint, unrecorded voices in the margins of the parchment, to consider the map not as a trophy of discovery, but as a silent witness to a much longer, more complex human conversation about the world. This holistic view is the final key to understanding these 30 maps. They are not merely clues to lost voyages or advanced ancient knowledge. They are bridges between worlds, between ways of knowing. They remind us that every line drawn is a story, and every story depends on who is holding the pen and who is already there waiting on the shore. 30 pieces of parchment, scattered across continents and centuries, form a single, sprawling narrative of the human mind. This is not a story of steady progress from darkness into light. Instead, these maps reveal a history of geography that is far more human, a messy, looping journey of brilliant deduction and stubborn error, of whispers preserved across millennia and entire civilizations vanishing into the margins. From the Babylonian world disk to the satellite overlays of modern labs, the thread that connects them is our relentless, imperfect drive to make the world fit on a page. The practical Portolan chart and the speculative heart of Terra Australis are not opposites. They are two expressions of the same impulse, one born from the need to survive a voyage, the other from the need to complete a philosophical vision. Together, they dismantle the simplistic textbook timeline where blank spaces are simply filled in by heroic explorers. The true pattern that emerges is one of profound interconnection and heartbreaking loss. Knowledge was not invented in one place and time. It was a relay race where the baton was often dropped. A coastline recorded by a Chinese fleet might inform an Arab globe, which could influence a Korean synthesis, whose echoes might eventually reach a Venetian workshop, only to be copied once and then lost to a library fire. The maps that survived are the lucky ones, the fragments of a global conversation that was mostly held in whispers. What they challenge us to do is to hold two truths at once. We must celebrate the astonishing accuracy of a medieval chart while also accepting the phantom islands that anchored a sailor's fears. We can be awed by a line that predicts a continent's shape while acknowledging the cultures who lived on that continent long before the line was ever drawn. These 30 puzzles, viewed as a whole, invite us into a more humble and more wondrous understanding of our past. They show that our ancestors were not primitive souls stumbling in the dark, but keen observers, brilliant synthesizers, and daring storytellers who used the best tools they had to answer the most fundamental questions: where are we, and what lies beyond the horizon? The final lesson is not about any single lost civilization or secret voyage, but about the fragile, precious nature of understanding itself. It is a web easily torn, constantly rewoven, and always more vast and intricate than we can possibly see from any single point within it. The final lesson of these 30 maps is not a single answer, but a changed perspective. Each parchment and stone tablet we have examined is more than a relic. It is a conversation frozen in time, a dialogue between the known and the imagined, between the cartographer's hand and the vast, whispering world beyond the workshop window. They stand as silent witnesses to a truth we often forget. History is not a single story written in stone, but a chorus of overlapping voices, many of which have faded to a barely audible echo. These artifacts are those echoes captured in ink and vellum, waiting in the quiet corners of libraries and museums for someone to listen closely and hear the questions they still ask. Whether they point to the sophisticated networks of medieval Asia, the hard-won empirical knowledge of a Mediterranean sailor, or the breathtaking possibility of a prehistoric epoch now buried under ice, they collectively expand our sense of what the human mind is capable of perceiving and preserving. They challenge the neat, linear narrative of progress, replacing it with something far more interesting: a web of connections, dead ends, and brilliant leaps in the dark. This exploration invites you to carry forward two things: a sense of wonder at the sheer ambition of our ancestors to map their existence, and a sharp, critical curiosity about the stories we accept as settled history. Look at the past not as a closed book, but as an open investigation. Which of these 30 portals resonated most deeply with you? Was it the navigational genius of the Marshallese stick chart, the cryptic claims of the Piri Reis parchment, or the ethical reframing demanded by the Kangnido map? The conversation continues in the comments below. Share your thoughts on the most compelling mystery, and subscribe for more journeys into the heart of history's greatest enigmas. Remember, the map of human knowledge is still being drawn with every new discovery and every re-examined artifact. You are not just a spectator of this story, you are part of the ongoing expedition.